England, in a little town called Maidstone, which is about 40 miles southeast of London, market town, and I had a paper out there. Somebody on my paper route had Hot Rod magazine, but I just sit on the curb reading it, looking at pictures of red and yellow cars under blue skies, and we were surrounded by brown and green cars and grey skies, and so to see this sort of colourful world was, it was like watching a magic show or something like that. It was so alien from our daily lives in, we still might have had petrol rationing then in England after the war, but I mean, it was a dreary country, and it still is. So that was just really eye-opening, that there was this whole other world out there that we really knew nothing about. And then I think in '63, one of the newspapers, I think it was called The People, got involved in bringing a couple of dragsters to England. How that happened, I don't really know. But one was a company called Mooneyes, which still exists. The company's still in Santa Fe Springs, owned by some really good Japanese friends of mine. And so they brought the Mooneyes dragster to England to do some exhibition runs. And then a guy called Mickey Thompson, who was another huge influence on the industry, he sort of, muscled his way in. So two dragsters came to England, and I persuaded my dad to take us to go see it. And, it was kind of electrifying. I mean, the Mooneyes dragster especially was bright yellow, and they took me to Brighton, which is a seaside town on the south coast of England. And they used to have a sprint there, which is like a single-car drag race. So you race the clock and not another car. They took these dragsters down there, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. And I think one of the dragsters set the hay bales on fire. It was just outrageous, just absolutely mind-blowing as a kid in England then. And I was hooked and just absolutely loved it all. And luckily, my dad wasn't into cars at all. He was into beer. But he was, a really good dad. And whenever I said, I want to go, he would always take me. And then the following year, I think there was a thing called the Drag Fest, when they shipped 10 cars over from the US to race in England. And again, my dad took me and my school buddies, and was it the following year? One year it just hammered down with rain like it only can do in England, I guess. And but it didn't matter. We were there, we were watching the racing. And then in '66, they opened the first proper drag strip in England. So it just was its 60th anniversary. It opened Easter weekend, 1966, and I went there. We got the bus and hitchhiked and did whatever we could to get to the track. And it was miserable. I mean, it rained. It was just awful. But we were there, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter what the weather was like. It was foggy. You couldn't see anything. Wasn't much to see. It was 1966 England. Nobody had any money. And that was one of the hard things for the whole hot rod drag racing sport. We didn't have the raw material that America has. We did have some 32 Fords. They were built in England, but during the war we had scrap drives, and all those cars went to scrap. And then what cars didn't go to scrap went stock car racing. So they all got destroyed in the 50s. So by the time I was aware, they were pretty much all destroyed, and there were probably maybe a dozen or so cars in England, right caliber. But it was hard to get into it, and also, not growing up in a car family, you couldn't figure out how to do that. You just didn't know. You had no reference point to try and go and figure out how can I get more involved in this. There were a couple of car clubs started up, and that helped. But again, England, back then was really austere. There was no money. We didn't even have a garage. We had a row house. So that if you wanted to work on your car, you were out in the street in the rain. So it was very, very difficult to get involved. But my uncle had a Riley, a 1946 Riley, which looked a little bit like a 34 Ford. It had a nice chrome grille, and my dad agreed to buy it for me. And I completely, ruined it, hot rodded it, you know. But he wasn't angry. He was never upset. But I mean, I took the hood sides off, chromed some bits of the engine, painted flames on the bonnet, on the hood, and just made a mess of it. Really, it was a funny little car. It was a 4-door. So it wasn't right, you know, nobody wants a 4-door hot rod, that's a taxi, you know, so we all want 2 doors. A buddy of mine, he and I started a little motorcycle business. We started building choppers, you know, bikes with long front ends. We were, you know, hopeless at it, absolutely hopeless. But it gave us a start, and I went for welding lessons, and he was a pretty canny engineer, you know, amateur engineer. Not trained at all, but I learned a lot from him. Robin, his name was, and so we had this little business, and it was a side job to our proper occupations. At that time, there was you know, a lot of activity in London with hot rods and motorcycles and choppers. And I was working as a telecoms engineer then, and hated it, just hated it. Didn't, you know, was not interested at all. And a good friend of ours wrote a story for a magazine called Bike. The story came out, and it was okay. It wasn't great, it was okay. It wasn't particularly special. And I used to work with this old guy, his name was Joe, and he was an argumentative old man, and he would argue black was white all night, just to mess with you, you know? So I said, Joe, look, this story came out, and it's not very good. And so I wrote to the editor, a guy called Mark Williams. Didn't just sort of criticize him, or I tried to sort of be constructive and say, hey, if you've done this or if you've done that. So he wrote back to me, when people still wrote to people. I still have the letter somewhere. And he said, if you're so clever, write for it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll give that a go. And he said, yeah, you like drag racing? Go do a story about drag racing. So off I went, and I go to the track that I went to in '66. This was about 42, I think. And, I'm getting paid. I'm getting a track pass. I got in for free, and I would have gone anyway. I would have paid for all of those things, but now I'm getting paid to go. And so that part of it was great. And I turned the story in, and he goes, "Oh, this is great. This is really good." So he published it. I got paid, I think, 25 quid or something, not much. Photographs were terrible. He sent along some college kid to take the pictures because everything was on a budget. You know, nobody had any money. Just awful. So I'm showing the story to my dad, and he said, "Well, I could buy you a camera." He said, "You can take bad pictures as good as anybody." So he bought me a little Russian camera called a Zenith, which was a knockoff of a Zenith, and that was, I think, it was 20 quid or something like that. It wasn't much. And so I now was, getting a track pass, getting paid for the photographs, even though they weren't very good. So it was a little package. And I kind of, how some people say, I understood instantly how the business kind of worked. So I went back to Mark, he published a story, and he said, "What else do you want to do?" I said, "Well, my buddy is a big custom painter." And I said, "Can I do a story about custom painting?" He goes, "Sure, off you go." So now I'm off again, and now I'm writing a story about a friend of mine. I'm helping his business. And I never, really struggled to find stories. There's a story in every person you meet, mostly, not always, but of course, lots of people, there was an interesting story somewhere. And that part came real easily. But what was very difficult in England back then was there were no jobs. There was Bike magazine, and then in about 72, magazine called Custom Car came out, which is still published as a printed magazine. I think Bike might even be. I had a good friend in Stockholm, and we were exporting motorcycles, going over there for vacations, just having a good time. And a friend of mine there said, I have a 1932 Ford. You can have it. Great, I'll have it. So we go to Gothenburg to pick it up, and it's just a pile of rusty. He just must have shoveled it onto the trailer. I mean, it's absolutely crap. It was so bad, I walked past it. I was so embarrassed. I was with a bunch of other people who come to help me. I couldn't look at it. It was just awful. And anyway, we loaded it up, took it home, just junk, absolute junk. And a Swedish friend of mine says, "Well, you know why he gave it to you?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, it's the ugly one." I said, "Well, what do you mean the ugly one? It's a 1932 Ford. How can it be ugly?" And he goes, "Well, they made one in England, and they made one in the US. Well, they made them in several countries around the world. But the one in England was ugly. They made it at home, in England, and it's not the same as an American 32 Ford. So it isn't cute. And so he said that's why he gave it to me. I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I tried to understand how that could possibly be. So I'm looking for a book about the history of the 32 Fords, why it would be, one's beautiful and this other one is the stepchild over here. And there wasn't any books about it at all, about that part of it. There are other books about how to restore those cars, but no books about why. And so a friend of mine, Tim Parker, was the publisher then of a company called Osprey. And I went to Tim and said, hey, there are no books about this. He's a commissioning editor. He said, well, write one. I worked on this book for 2 years. And it's been very successful. And it's, kind of the Bible on how that all came to be. In America, they had Henry Ford II and a guy called Bob Gregory. And they were the stylists for Ford, and they styled that car in America. And they did most of the early Fords from about 1927 up into the 40s. And I don't even know if either of them were trained, but they had a good eye. They knew what made a car look good. Whereas in England, we probably didn't want to be doing it anyway because it was American. They had, certainly no styling, less techniques, less money to make things round and smooth. So it tended to be square and boxy. I mean, when you see the two things together, it's like looking at an elephant and a giraffe. And I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed the research. I had to go to the Henry Ford Museum and spend weeks there going through, all of their materials and digging out all this stuff. And just by, again, pure luck, finding the right pictures. Because I'm in Dearborn, I'm going to get these photographs. They're going to copy them. I'm going to go to England, and then I'm going to put it together. Well, lucky, when I got back, I got the right pictures. I managed to sort of understand what I needed to be able to tell that story, even though I had no experience of doing that. In the meantime, when would that have been? Early 80s. In the meantime, I got to be editor of Custom Car. Somehow, attrition, people leaving, people getting fired, bang, suddenly I'm the editor. And I loved it, but I suddenly found it very claustrophobic. I'm thinking, now here I am, I'm in my 30s, and I'm the editor. I can't do this for the next 30 years. I was working for this company called SoCal Speed Shop, which was founded in 1946 and ostensibly went land speed racing back in the 40s. Because Alex, the guy who founded it, understood that if he went racing, he could sell parts. And it's an old adage, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. It's a car adage from the old days. And this friend of mine, Kiwi Steve, had a car for sale that he'd been driving and racing at El Mirage. He goes, do you want to buy it? I said, yeah, sure. Why not? So we had a guy working for us called Jimmy Shine, who, that's not his real name, but he's a personality. He's a car builder. He's very aggressive in that way. He's got a good look. It was all the right ingredients. So I said to Jimmy, if I buy this car, you drive it, and we will build publicity for our company by going racing, doing what we did in 1946. So we bought the car and we raced it for 4 or 5 years, and it was a fantastic experience, really, really cool, because we would drive the car to Bonneville, so that's 700 miles in a hot rod to Bonneville, and then he'd put the blower on, and then we'd go race. And we got up there, and I think we were doing 175-ish. Hot Rod Magazine came along and did a story about us, so we instantly got loads of publicity, and that was through David Freiberger. And we thought, well, if this will go 175, it'll go 200. So we go and get a better engine, and we do some more work on it. Mostly Jimmy, I'm not a very good mechanic, but we get it up, and finally, in about 2003, I think it was, we got it to 200 miles an hour. And it's a fantastic feeling. We are, even now, speechless, because we never thought we'd get there. So I call my wife and say, hey, we went 200. She goes, did you get a record? I went, no. She said, then you're not done yet, are you? Bang, put the phone down. It's great. I mean, she wasn't doing it in a facetious way. She was just going, it's not over yet. And so then we had to try and figure out how we could get a record. And the record at the time was 203 miles an hour. Now remember, this is a street roadster. So that was pretty quick in that time. And I couldn't figure out how to do that. I didn't have any money. And luckily, a friend of mine in England called Peter Stevens said, well, if you can get the car to England, we can put it in a wind tunnel and we can measure, how it does. And we can get it to go faster without spending any money. Now, shipping it to England is one thing, and the wind tunnel was $15 a minute. There's a lot of money. So, nothing that I could afford, really. Would have been easier to buy a bigger engine. But I went back to David Freiberger at Hot Rod Magazine and said, look, if I go do this, will you buy the story? He goes, absolutely. So now I've got, a few grand from David for the story. And then I went to another friend of mine, John Reed, and said, can you help me ship it? So we shipped it to England, and we put it in the wind tunnel, and long story short, came back, got the record. It was only to do with that. There was a lot more involved, but basically, and I, again, learned a lot about putting the car in the wind tunnel, what's involved, what works, what doesn't, because some things you think, oh, we'll do that, and it doesn't work, because the wind is going, wherever it wants to go, and you think you're going to do something that will improve it, but not always. So that was just really fascinating. I mean, I got massive enjoyment out of the achievement. So it was Jimmy driving, and I give him huge kudos for that. I mean, he did and because we were getting an engine from a friend of ours, Bill Mitchell, and we were going to go racing in September. And I don't know where I've been doing something. And Jimmy goes, but we're going in August. I said, but we don't have an engine. Bill thinks we're going in September. He said, well, we're going in August. So somehow or other, Bill got us an engine, Jimmy built it, drove it to Chico, put it on the dyno, drove back to LA, put it in the car, drove to Bonneville, got the record. It was funny because I was driving onto the Salt. I was late that year. I was working somewhere else. So I was late, and I get onto the Salt, and they said, the Thacker and Shine, they burned the piston. That's probably them done. And I'm driving on thinking, all this way and we're not going to do it. Well, luckily, a good friend of ours, Silky, Kiwi guy, as he left the shop, he saw a spare piston laying on the bench and thought, I better take that. So we grabbed that piston and we get to Bonneville, we burn a piston and Silky's got the piston. So they put it in and get the record. I mean, it's stories like that just choke you up. I've just met some incredible people. I met everybody from George Bush II to Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top. And so that part of it has been the interesting journey because, what make us, that's what it is. The car is just something that gets you there. So, meeting all of those different people and then, ending up with a bunch of friends all over the world, it's really good fun.